All right, we're going to get started. So welcome everyone to a special Liberty 250 lecture with Fraunces Tavern Museum. Remember, if you're joining us virtually and you have any questions during the lecture, to please leave them in the Q&A box. We'll be monitoring the Q&A during the lecture, so don't worry about saving your question to the end. If you're joining us in person, you'll be able to ask your questions at the end of the lecture. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. And as always, please note that the views of the speakers are their own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York or its Fraunces Tavern Museum. With that, I would like to introduce Kostya Kennedy, who is the editor-in-chief of premium publishing at Meredith. A former senior writer and editor at Sports Illustrated, he is the author of True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson, as well as the New York Times bestsellers 56, Joe DiMaggio and the Last Magic Number in Sports, and Pete Rose, An American Dilemma. All three books won the Casey Award for Best Baseball Book of the Year. He has taught at Columbia and New York University and lives with his family in Westchester County, New York. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kostya Kennedy. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out and getting wet for us. And those of you on the Zoom, thank you for staying dry for us. So it's great to have you here. It's a beautiful place. I love the exhibit out there. And I'm just going to talk a little bit. These are just kind of visual aids, but I'll kind of talk you through it. And really looking forward to questions and anything you have. You know, the first, I usually get things like, oh, well, are you going to ride a horse or bring a lantern when you go? And so I'm not actually Paul Revere, for all of you to know. And my first regret is that I didn't start the book a little earlier, because by the time I did start, Paul was dead. And so were most of his friends. So it made the reporting a little more challenging. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the reporting. I just want to, an initial question I often get is why Paul Revere? Why'd you come to him? And there's sort of two things. One is sort of on the emotional level, as many of you may have also experienced. I remember being read the poem, Listen, My Children, and You Shall Hear, of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere when I was, I don't know, 8 or 9, long, well enough to read, but I loved being read to so much. And it being read to me out of this big volume of poetry with no pictures. And I've realized how important that was, actually, because it was left for me to imagine what it would be. And so my Paul Revere's ride might be different from yours. And the other thing that sort of drew me to it was the simple fact of Revere sort of knowing what time it was in his life. And at the beginning of this absolutely ridiculous, audacious thing they were going to try to pull off of taking on the Royal Army, and what happened in those 7, 9, 12 hours, whatever we want to call it, that really shaped and changed all that was to come. And this whole course of events that we're now beginning and going to work through over the 250-year anniversary would have been very different. We wouldn't still be eating crumpets and strawberry and cream at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but we wouldn't have quite so swiftly succeeded. The Patriots wouldn't have quite so swiftly succeeded against the British if not for Paul Revere's ride in that night. So I'm going to mainly talk through here. I'm just going to give a quick short reading of the first sort of page and a half of the book, which sets the stage a little bit for how critical this ride was. And so just, again, I'm sure people know, but just to say, Revere set out, it was a Tuesday night, April 18th of 75. And he went out to rouse the countryside to get themselves together and come to Lexington and Concord to meet the British where they were. And but the next morning at dawn was when the first shot was fired. So that's the timeline of where we are. And that was the initial, then the Patriots routed the British there. What if the militiamen had not been waiting at the Lexington Green at dawn on that April day in 1775 to test and slow the British? What if they had not then been at Concord a few hours later, 220 strong, ready and resolute on the high ground? Those Patriot soldiers arrived by the hundreds that morning, then by the thousands, armed and keen and strengthened in their numbers. They mustered on the damp open fields and on the forest edges along the old Concord road, farmers and tradesmen with their muskets and fowling pieces in hand. They turned back the redcoats and then fired on them in their retreat, routing them out of town and back off the land that the patriots knew now as their own. Villagers from the highlands and the low, ministers and deists and non-believers, men dressed in whatever clothes they had, their patched and varied breeches, their worn, straight-laced boots, a hodgepodge of an earnest crew, transformed by necessity and determination into American soldiers, who that morning showed the will that would drive them in the weeks and months ahead, the will that would win the Revolutionary War. Suppose they had not come that morning after all. Suppose they had not been so timely in their arrival, not been so committed to their call. Suppose instead, the seasoned British soldiers, in their fine cocked hats and under their general's command, had in their ransacking of conquered Barrett Farm found and taken the stores of gunpowder and ammunition they had come to seize. Imagine if the British had caught the Americans by surprise as they'd attended. Imagine if, in Lexington, they had killed or captured Samuel Adams or John Hancock, delivering on the bounty that had been put on those men by the king. What would have happened to the path of the American Revolution then, if not for that first morning of battle of impudent, plucky, stunning, and world-shifting patriot success? Would the rebelling American army have continued to mobilize so confidently? Would it have stayed so unified in the face of defeat and death, have remained so emboldened to succeed? Would the army have fared so well, even in defeat, in the Battle of Bunker Hill 8 weeks later? Would the revolution have unfolded so quickly as it did? Would we have July 4th, 1776, as America's Day of Independence? Or how much longer might the British have held their grip into the 1780s, the 1790s, the 1800s, and beyond? And if they had held that longer grip, what might then have been the implications for the establishment and growth of the American democracy in the years and decades that followed? What would be the implications today? When we ask these things, when we consider the plausible alternatives to the chain of events that occurred on April 18th and April 19th, 1775, we are asking this: what might have happened? How might the much documented and much deconstructed birth of our nation have unfolded, and with what repercussions, had not Paul Revere mounted his borrowed horse and set out to ride those critical miles and those critical hours across the simmering moonlit land to rouse the countryside and deliver the news? What would have become of the revolution, of its crucial early days? What would have become of the whole hard, taxing, extraordinary journey to independence, if not for Paul Revere and his midnight ride? Okay, so that's kind of putting a lot on this guy. He got on his horse, and I'm just going to take you through a little bit. So as I mentioned, Paul was in fact dead, and so were his friends. So I had other reporting to do. This is a bell at the Old North Church. Some of you know the Old North Church, have been there. So it's the same church now in the north end of Boston that was there in 1775 and well before that, but it's the church where the lanterns were hung, the two lanterns. And these bells were rung at that time. They're still rung today, and they were rung then. My book is not a sort of cradle to grave story of Paul Revere. It's not meant to be all known thought about him. But I did include things that I felt were in service of the ride, or in service of telling you who it was, who would be the person who would get on that horse and risk everything he had. And the Old North Church was significant, obviously, for its role at night, but also as a child, Paul Revere rang bells there. He himself climbed up to the top and would ring the bell to bring people there. So I, of course, because there was sort of limited reporting to do, I wanted to climb to the top of Old North Church. Now, again, some of you may have done this on a regular tourist sort of walk. You can go up maybe 2 stores and there's a bell ringer's room, 2 stories and there's a bell ringer's room. I wanted to go to the top, and I was determined to do so. And just as a little bit of a background, I do not like heights. I do not like heights at all. And a quick story. Melissa mentioned I worked at Sports Illustrated, and one time I was doing a story on a rock climber out at Yosemite National Park. And he was this really wonderful young rock climber who made a lot of a sense of El Capitan, that big sheer rock face there. And we were there in the park, standing on another rock overlooking the valley. And he was talking to me about it. And he's kind of standing up here where I am, looking out, talking. And I'm interviewing him, but I'm back there in the recesses where you can see, I just can't get that close. And I'm saying, listen, man, I want to talk to you, but I can't come. I'm sorry. He was really sweet with me. He was like, listen, I had a lot of fear too. And it's a good thing to have as a rock climber. It prevents you from getting sloppy and you're more careful. And so what I used to do, he said, is I would lie down on my stomach and peer out that way. And that way I could look. And I was like, thank you, that's such a great idea. So I lay down on my stomach, but I stayed back there. I didn't move. I didn't move half a foot closer. So this is the guy who now wants to climb Old North Church. And I go there to climb. I had to sort of sign up and get special dispensation. And the guy who's leading me up there, first he gives me a waiver and he's like, if you fall inside the property, we'll take care of you. If you fall outside the property, you're on your own. So I was like, okay, I signed it. We went up, and the first two stories that I mentioned are pretty basic. They're just kind of old staircases. Then it gets a little more complicated. It's a sort of very narrow, rickety, uneven staircase, which leads you up kind of near, you can now see the bells a little bit. And then it becomes a series of ladders. And you go up maybe 12 steps, and then there's a break into the small landing, and you turn and you go up another set. And we're doing this, and I wanted to go at night, of course, because that's when it happened. And it's January, it's cold, and it's dark. It's really dark, and I am having a hard time. And Julius, the guy who works there, is going ahead of me, says to me, call down, don't look down. So I'm like, okay. And he says, then don't look up. So I didn't, but when I did look up briefly, you could see the moonlight coming in through the top of the church, right below the steeple, the tower, which was, to me, just, I imagined, oh, this is what they did when they climbed up to hang the lantern. When I'm getting a little closer, there's some louvered windows with no panes. So all of a sudden now it's not only dark and cold, but there's this wind coming in like, they had put screens in. So in the day when Robert Newman climbed to hang the lanterns, or in Longfellow's day, because he also climbed up there, there were pigeons. They appear in the poem and elsewhere. Now there are no pigeons, but there's also no glass. So it's cold and windy, and I'm holding on for dear life and almost crying, I'm telling you. And then though, when I got up there, it was amazing to be at that point. I mean, you're at the highest point around in that area of Boston. Obviously, it's a lot different, right? Then there was no light anywhere, basically. Now there's like cars honking, and there's a basketball game going on at the Y, and all of this. But still, you could look out and you could see over the Charles River where Revere crossed, and there's a rendition of it in the painting over there. And you could see the Charlestown shore, which he came to, and it was still there. You could see the old Copt cemetery, which features in Longfellow's poem, and which Revere would have seen. And so there were moments like that which made me want to help bring me a little closer, I felt. And I felt that the last thing I'll say on this is, Revere was the one who came up with the idea to hang the lanterns and gave the instructions. But it's not as if I say, hey, Jim, do me a favor, run up and put the light on. He runs up to the attic and pulls the switch. This guy had to do that whole climb that I did on even more rickety situation, with lanterns strapped around him, with a tinderbox in his pocket. So even that little part of it was pretty demanding, and something that was required of somebody to do and do well on this night. This is the Green Dragon Tavern. It's just a nice thing I wanted to show because we're here at Fraunces Tavern. I'm not an expert of it, so there are experts here about Fraunces Tavern, but I do know that this was a place where Sons of Liberty met in the late 1760s and early 1770s, and so was the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston. And that was where Revere was a Mason. He was a Freemason, and they would have their meetings at this tavern. And this is essentially where they plotted and devised the Tea Party, various acts of resistance was done in a building just like that. It's no longer there. There's the man himself. I just wanted to show that maybe some people might know it. It's a Jonathan Singleton Copley, or Copley, as it said, painting. And it's the only image we have of Revere at sort of prime of life, height of life. There's two others commissioned. One was commissioned by his son when he's much older. But what I liked about this is that most of the people who had their paintings, their portraits drawn, were very wealthy, accomplished people of a certain standing in society. It was a little rarer to have somebody like Revere, who's a silversmith and among other things, a self-trained dentist. I'm not signing up for that, but apparently had enough customers to have this done. And there's no accident. There's a teapot in there. This was after the tax on the tea had gone into effect. And I also look at the way his hand is. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen anyone strike that pose not in jest. Like, I mean, who does that seriously? Like, puts their hand, yes, take my picture. Not Paul Revere. Maybe some people do, but not Paul Revere. He was much more of a man of the people. He was a hail fellow, well met. And I think he's kind of winking at us a little bit. He's telling us he's up to something. So I really like the picture of him and what we see in him. So this is, some people may recognize this. This is the famous engraving of the Boston Massacre. Again, I don't talk about everything that Revere did. It's all, as I said, in service of the ride and service of that time. But this was a critical event where some redcoats fired on locals in Boston. Revere didn't paint this, but he engraved it and sold and put out the painting. And it appeared in the papers, and it's a gross exaggeration of what actually happened. It is the bare facts of it are true that shots were fired, but it was a pretty angry, huge mob of patriots, colonists, kind of descending and crowding in on these redcoats, who eventually did open fire. It's not as if they walked into the square and started shooting people, but this was a bit of propaganda that they wanted to get out there, and they wanted to get people support. Again, what a big deal. We're going to go take on the British. Us farmers, are going to go take on these guys. So it helped too, and this appeared in the Boston Gazette, but also the Virginia Gazette. It appeared throughout the colonies at that time, and was a big part of increasing sympathy and increasing loyalty to the cause. And that we would know this, like, this would have endured even without the ride, right? So the ride is clearly the thing that Paul Revere is known about. It's known, but historians would know about him and know about this engraving and some other things as well. This is a little tough to see, maybe, or maybe not. Pretty big, nicely done. So you can just see his route out, and you can see that he went over the water first. He's leaving from the north end of Boston and making his way to Lexington, and was hoping to get to Concord, where he did not quite get. That's just a general idea of where he went. The red line is the key one. That's the British troops, Paul Revere's line, and then there's a line for William Dawes, who I'll get to in a moment. There's the Somerset. So as I mentioned, he crossed the river. That was the first way to get out of Boston. He had to get across the Charles River. And in that river was a huge, huge boat, the HMS Somerset. I think it's obviously drawn as a representation. I think it doesn't probably do justice to the size that the boat occupied in the river at that time. It had to be actually warped in, which means they had to pull big cables to maneuver it into the river. That's how tight it was. So it couldn't just kind of sail in that. So it occupied that big of a space, certainly at low tide. And that boat was there. It was a British warship, 68-gun warship that had served in the French and Indian War. It had a long history to it. It was a very powerful, successful boat. And it was there on that night expressly to keep people from leaving the city, and expressly to keep Paul Revere, who everybody knew who Paul Revere was at that point, from leaving the city. Not just him, anybody, but he was one of them. He was on the enemy's list and known. And they didn't do it. They just failed. Revere was able to ride by quietly at night, obviously at great risk of life. And the boat, the Somerset, emerges as kind of a minor character, maybe even too much, but a little bit of a character in my book. it went on to serve in the war for the British. Fired on Bunker Hill, not very successfully, but fired from essentially this position, slightly over on Bunker Hill. And then during the war, would ride up and down the shores of the Cape a lot. And the British soldiers or seamen would get out and kind of ransack the towns and try to get supplies and get things. And then it ran aground in 1778, kind of near, for those who know the Cape, near the bend, the Cape kind of goes out like that. And Provincetown is at the end, and Truro is the sort of next proper town over, North Truro and Truro. And between Provincetown and Truro, it ran ashore. The Cape Codders came down, descended on the boat, rounded up the men. The British marched them back to Boston and burned that ship down to the waterline, completely burned it, an act of retaliation. And there it stayed. And over the years, it would occasionally emerge and be seen because of the tides. And in the early 70s, 1970s, the rest of the Somerset was suddenly seen, and they're visible in the tide. And the Park Service came down and cut down the remaining wood, huge sort of pickup truck sized pieces of wood to preserve it and keep. Now, if it's very rare that it's visible at all. When it is, and I think the last time was 2019, they're just sort of strips of kind of runners of wood. But of course, I'm looking for something to do some real live reporting with. So I wanted to go see the remains of the Somerset. So I went up, and they're housed sort of in this big warehouse. And the park ranger who took me to see it was sort of like, well, technically these belong to the British, but nobody's come to collect. And it's just amazing, for me, and maybe for some of you, it was just amazing to sit on this wood, which is amazingly well preserved. It's not treated or kept in any way. It had been, under water and sand for 200 years. So oxygen didn't get to it. That probably helped preserve it. But it's this massive boat with these trunnels or tree nails that are 2-3 feet wide, no metal on the boat at all. It's all wood. And you can see the initials of somebody who helped build it in Plymouth, England in 1744. So an amazing thing for me, again, just sitting on that boat and understanding the different elements that played a part in this night. Just 1 second. Okay, I just want to quickly talk about two others who rode that night. So one thing I want to say about Revere, let me just hop back. When you look at that ride and see him go out the north of Boston, right? So he's that checkered line. You see him stopping in Medford on the way to Lexington. There are other towns there too that are not marked on this map. Revere would tell people to get their act that it was time to get roused up and come to Lexington and Concord. And then in many cases, those people would get on their own horse and ride somewhere else and tell somebody else who would then get on a horse. And it inspired this whole neural network of people, sort of, you can imagine looking above, kind of fanning out across the countryside. And when you think about it, there's no way by the time the British got certainly to Concord and then on the way back, there were 2,000-3,000 people there. There's no way that one guy on his horse is going to rally that many people, however effective he is. So Revere was the progenitor, and he got them all going out on the way to Lexington. One other person was dispatched from Boston that night. So Joseph Warren, who told Revere to go out over the water, and he sent William Dawes to go out by land. Dawes had to get past some British guards, and he kind of feigned being a drunken fool and got himself past. And he also came to Lexington. Their stop to Lexington was to warn Hancock and Adams. But when Revere got there, Dawes still wasn't there, and they didn't know why. And he finally made it about half hour later. And one of the interesting things, a lot of people say, oh, Dawes was, he was also out equally brave, could have easily been killed, could have, all of that stuff. And Revere was very concerned about him and said in the deposition, where was Dawes, and asked about him. But for whatever reason, Dawes didn't really seem to alert anybody. They have sort of a list and roll of the people who were at Concord and Lexington, and there aren't people from the towns that he went through. And we can come back to that and why that might be and the things that Revere did. So that's part of the reason why not as much is known about Dawes, is that he doesn't appear, despite great will, to have been that effective. After getting to Lexington, spending some time there, the two men went on towards Concord, and on the way to Concord, they ran into this other fellow, Samuel Prescott, who was a young doctor in the area, and Revere kind of sized them up, and they said, okay, come with us and alert people. And they wanted him there because Prescott, a doctor who would go to people's houses, they felt he knew people. And it gave a little credence. If I just show up and you don't know me, I'd say, hey, get your gun, leave your wife and your family, and just come on. We're going to take on the British. You might have a little bit of hesitation. If it's your family doctor who's been there 15 times, you might trust him a little more. So he came along to help. And then they ran into British soldiers, and it was only Prescott who made it all the way to Concord. Revere had to get off his horse, and he walked straight back into the breach into Lexington to continue the night. So again, I imagine for many people, this man and his poem is an entry to Paul Revere. So the people probably know, but I asked it, the ride was in April of 1775. Does anybody know when this poem was published or written? So it was written in 1860 and first published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1861. So it's 85 years later. And it was written as a call for abolitionists, as a call to rise up against slavery. And to show, Longfellow was pointedly not political on many issues, but he was very much anti-enslavement and went to rallies and wrote about it. He'd written a book of poems. And so there's lots of metaphorical allusions to that time, and it's sort of meant to try to inspire people to take a stand, to go up, take a risk. And that's how that poem came to be, and why it endured, and why it meant so much even at that time. Hancock's trunk. This is the last little bit of memorabilia. This is in, and I just did a talk up at the Worcester Museum in Worcester, Massachusetts. The reason why they were going to Lexington that night was because that's where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were staying. And nobody was sure exactly what the British plan was, including many of the British soldiers themselves, because it was held very closely. But they thought they were going out to try to get Hancock and Adams. Sam Adams and John Hancock were out there, by the way. They lived in Boston, but it was just getting too hot. There were vandals would come to Hancock's house, and they could have been arrested at any time. And so they moved out to Lexington, where it was a little safer, nearer to the provincial Congress. And it was Revere who helped get them out of Lexington, and they're on their way to a town called Woburn, when they suddenly realized, kind of like when they left Kevin at home in Home Alone, that they left Hancock's trunk back at Buckman Tavern in the heart of Lexington. And this trunk was filled with, Hancock was an extremely wealthy man. He essentially financed the whole Boston part of the Revolution, early part. Filled with documents, papers, people they thought were spies for the British, people who they knew were spies for the Patriots. If it had fallen into the hands of the British, it was really a big deal. And so it was Revere and another man named John Lowell who went back on foot to get this trunk from Buckman Tavern. And that's why Revere was on the green at Lexington Green when that first shot went off. No longer on his horse, but carrying that trunk at the end of his night. Yeah, that's just an image. As I mentioned, there was, Melissa showed me there was a painting there of him getting on his horse. That's not correct, and that the horse was a brown horse. That much we know for sure. It was a canter and it was a pacer, I mean, and a brown horse named Brown Beauty. Anyway, here's just a rendition. None of them are 100% accurate, but they all get the point across. And does anybody know what he might have been saying while he's doing that, or have any guesses? I'll just, what was that? The regulars are coming out, somebody said. Yes, no, you said, that's exactly right. He wasn't going to say the British are coming, because they were all kind of British at that point. But the other point is he wasn't going to be yelling either, right? You had to say it loud enough to be heard, but there were British soldiers all on the street trying to stop him. You couldn't just go and start yelling out. You had to be pretty quiet about it. And another thing about that's interesting is the light, which is always depicted in different ways in different paintings, including on the cover of my book. There was a kind of a gibbous moon that night, and it's not irrelevant because the British knew how much light they'd have. There was some lanterns and stuff, but you were heavily dependent upon the moonlight and the starlight. If you went on a completely cloud-covered night, it was going to be a lot more difficult. The flip side, of course, is that you can see where you're going, but they can see you. So it makes it at once more dangerous and feasible. So that's about where we are. It's a little after 7, and I can keep talking on this, but I'd love to open up to questions in the room, or I think Melissa's gonna moderate. I know there was a question while it was going on that I asked to hold on to. But.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a question from Zoom, so I'll start with that. I will
ask,
since you're up there with our web mic, if you can repeat the question so everyone on Zoom can hear after us.
Okay.
So we have from Stephen, why did Longfellow write the poem when he did and the way he did? I think you covered that a little bit, but just to expand on that.
Okay, so the question came from Stephen from home. Why did Longfellow write the poem when he did and the way he did? So he wrote the poem when he did, and I did mention that directly on the verge of the Civil War, at a time when he was very much against slavery, and as sort of a rally cry. He wrote it in this very lyrical way to try to get people to come along, right? So when Longfellow at that time chose to write a poem, it was no small thing. He'd already written Evangeline. He'd written Song of Hiawatha. He was the most well-known poet, the most highly paid poet in the world. When Charles Dickens came to Boston, he wanted to see Longfellow. So when Longfellow did a major work such as this, there was going to be a response.
Hi, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
This ship that we were talking about before, was this again?
The HMS Somerset.
Somerset. If they had burned that ship down, all those cannons, the ship's bell, many other heavy iron things would still be there. Have that been retrieved? Or maybe the British got their guns back, or maybe the Americans came later to retrieve them because they would have been valuable.
Great question. Should I repeat that for the Zoom crowd?
Yes.
Okay. So the question is about the ship that I mentioned, the Somerset, and when it was burnt, what about the sort of heavy artillery, the metal, the cannon, the ship's bell, guns, other things like that. So it's not entirely clear what happened. There are definitely some pieces which are on display in Provincetown and Truro, including the cat's head and maybe the ship's bell too. The weapons were probably taken and used by the Patriots. So if there were any workable cannons or workable guns, the British didn't get there. They never came for it. So anything that was used or taken would have been taken at that time or thrown overboard, or anything that was sort of in the bottom of the boat was probably destroyed because it did shipwreck. So that's as much as I know about where that all landed. Yes.
Specific question and a general question. The specific question, I wanted to follow up on the one if by land, two if by sea. Why did that matter if, essentially they were trying to communicate that the British were going towards Lexington and or Concord? Then the general question is, as part of your work on the book, did you develop insights or information that you had not seen before in the literature?
Yes. Again, repeat that.
Yes.
Okay. Two questions. One, what's the significance of one if by land, two if by sea? If if they knew they were going to Lexington and Concord, why did it matter? So first of all, I say they knew they felt and they thought, and it sure looked like they were going to Lexington and Concord. They didn't know for absolute sure. Sea is a little bit of a misnomer. It did come in from the sea, but it really means that they crossed the Charles River. So they went across a certain point. They actually went across to Cambridge. Revere also crossed the river, but went to Charlestown. If they had come out the southern route, it would have simply been a much different route for them to take. And it's just something you'd want people to be aware of, that there are British going to come through all these towns instead of going across that way. And the significance of the lanterns too, as I mentioned, there was a boat there to stop Revere and others from getting out, and they didn't want people to get out. They didn't know. There was no way. So when to take off from that a little bit, when Revere got to the far shore, they didn't even know that he would make it. There was no way to tell them that. So they wanted to signal a little bit to have some people know that not only one by land, two by sea, but yes, the British are now actually on the march. Nobody even knew that it was going to happen that night. It was just a general feeling that it might happen. The second question was a broader question about, did I discover any things about in the literature, which I hadn't, I guess, seen before or expected. You know, there were a lot of things. There wasn't sort of a smoking gun that he was the love child of Marie Antoinette or anything like that. I was hoping, but there were a few things. One was there was an involvement of the British general's wife, who may have helped get some information to the Americans, which was a kind of really interesting little nuance that I was able to follow. I'd seen mention of it, but I was able to take it into a new place. I think the other thing, and it's not entirely, it wasn't entirely unsaid, but to me it was a little striking, and I alluded to it a little bit before, was, you know, Revere got very close to Hancock, Samuel Adams, Joseph Warren, all these people, John Adams, who went to Boston Latin or Roxbury Latin. They all went to Harvard. They were, as I said, they were all wealthy, none wealthier than Hancock. Warren was a doctor. They were orators. He was not. He was the son of an immigrant, and these men tended to have long ancestral lines into the mid-1600s, including William Dawes. Revere's father came over in 1715, a Frenchman, not speaking much English, built up a silversmith business. Revere didn't go to any kind of fancy school. He went to what was called writing school. He was completely literate, but he wasn't like, you know, he was going to a life of use of his hands and all that, didn't go to college. And that he got so close to sort of the corridors of influence and power was really interesting to me. It said how much regard they had for him, how much they trusted him, and really an amazing story of somebody to have that kind of influence with that background.
One question from Zoom, then we'll go back to questions in the room. So we have another question that goes a little bit later in time. So the question is, didn't Revere's grandson fight in the Battle of Gettysburg?
Yes. He did and he I don't know all that much, but that's true, and I will say to people with the Revere name, wore it and continue to wear it proudly. For my live reporting, I spent some time with Paul Revere III. He's actually the fifth great grandson, but they weren't all named Paul, and he still takes wears it proudly, that they're descended from this man. And so there was a long history of tradition of allegiance to the American military, the American cause. And yes, his grandson did fight at Gettysburg.
Hi, I was just wondering if you could, I know this is his most famous ride, but if you could speak to some of the previous trips that you've taken before, and especially its relationship to the New York area.
Excellent. Again, for those on Zoom, it's asking about previous rides that Revere made before this ride. It's great to even know about that. Maybe everybody does, but I'll just say briefly, Revere was what was called an express rider. So in those days, I mean, long before the revolution began, there were post riders who were, if you had a letter and you were in Boston, you wanted to send it down to New York, you gave it to a post rider. They came along the post road, which is around here somewhere. And, 6 days later or 8 days later, whatever, it got down to New York. More than that, probably. Samuel Adams put into effect a network of express riders. And these were when it absolutely positively had to get there overnight. And he would, and Revere was the best they had. He was the single best express rider they had. It was not just because he was very good on a horse. It was because he was, John Adams had this quote where he just said, I can't give the whole context, but he just said, Paul Revere will give you the news. And what he meant by that was he was not only trustworthy, but he gave it to you. He didn't say, hey, how'd the wife and kids? What's going in the field? He told you what had to be told, didn't skimp on the details, made sure you knew what the assignment was. So when, in terms of other rides, as you mentioned, after the Tea Party, it was Revere that they dispatched to come down to Hartford, New York, Philadelphia, and say that the Tea Party had even occurred. That's the only way they would find out quickly. It was he who brought came to the Suffolk, brought the Suffolk Resolves to the First Continental Congress. This was in September, October of '74 in Philadelphia. He had a very critical ride up to Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the late winter of '74. So he was a very important rider for them. And to your point about New York, yes, he did come to New York on several occasions, and where he would meet with John Lamb, Isaac Sears, people who were familiar to those people who know New York history. Sears was great at getting a mob together, and they would trade information. And one thing that was really important then was, so even at the point of the Suffolk Resolves, which was, again, as I said, I think it's October of '74, so 5 months before this ride, there was a lot of dissension. I mean, even as it all started, not every colony, not every people within the colonies wanted to do this thing. And so rides like Revere coming down here and people coming up to Boston sort of help coalesce, like, this is what's happening here. What's happening there? What are you guys feeling? What are you guys thinking? And was really critical to generating the support.
I'm gonna read one more question from Zoom here before we go back to the room. So we have someone asking, is it true that Revere and Dawes happened on Prescott when Prescott was returning from a tryst with a married woman?
Oh my God, scandalous. The question is whether Dr. Prescott was returning from a tryst with a married woman at the time that they encountered him on the road to Concord. He was out on a social call. Let's put it that way. He was not visiting a patient. And so there seems to be a lot of truth to that. Not a whole lot is known about Prescott, but the woman who he was seeing did give some information about him. So that's who he was with that night. And that's what we know. Yeah.
You mentioned, I believe, a deposition that was given by Revere. Could you expand on that and what the context of that sort of interrogation was?
Yes. So he was a few days after, I have to check my timing exactly, but soon after the ride and it all began, when they realized, okay, now it's really happening. Because there were a couple of sort of false starts along the way. They asked Revere to give an account of that night. And that's how we first heard about Dawes, and we heard a lot about it. And he was asked in large part because they were trying to determine what we're still trying to determine today, who fired the first shot. And that was a big part of what they wanted to know. So he gave an account then. And what's interesting about that account is he says a lot of what he did. For example, he says, he describes getting to Charlestown, and he said, I alarmed almost every house as I went to Lexington. But he doesn't say the names of the people at that time, because it's pretty traitorous, right? It was treason if you were being part of this group. It was going to, if they'd lost, who wanted to be on the wrong side of that? So he was very careful and circumspect about what he said in detail. But he did give a pretty strong account of that night. He gave another account. And I will say also that at the time there were sort of people would often be deposed to give official accounts. Like I mentioned it, Revere rode up to Portsmouth in late '74. That there was also a conflict there with the British, and people were deposed after that to give an account. This was the only way they could sort of keep records of it. Then much later, well, not so much later, but in 1798, so yeah, 23 years later, the Massachusetts Historical Society was just opening up, or very young, and they brought Revere in and asked for, he gave a much longer, fuller description, very consistent with his initial one, but just simply richer in detail. Everybody knew how important it was right from the beginning, so that's why he was asked. Yes.
Got another question here from Zoom, which is, what did Revere do after the war and the rest of his life?
So what did he do after the war and for the rest of his life? So, well, during the war, I would say he was a lieutenant colonel for a while in Massachusetts militia. Had kind of things didn't go so well in Penobscot Bay. He had kind of a little bit of a rough turn there, but he was in the army. He had an incredibly long and productive life. He lived until 1818, age 83. He did a few different things. He became a bell maker himself. So I talked about bells early on, but Paul Revere and then Paul Revere's Bell Company, which then was out in Canton, Massachusetts, there are still bells today. There are more than 150 of Revere's bells are out there, many of them being rung on Sundays, most of them in New England, but some further south. There's one or two even out west. So he did that, but he also started a copper rolling company. And they rolled copper at a really critical time when not a lot of people were doing it. And some people have even said, you could say his most valuable thing he did was provide the copper for the War of 1812, which was used to sheath the hulls of the boats. And so he's very, very important in the War of 1812. And he remained a figure of, he's very proud of what he'd done. He remained a known figure. Hundreds of people came to his funeral. He lived a long, long life. He was married twice. And he was married to his second wife at the time of the ride, and they stayed married to the end of her life. She died in 1813, about 5 years before he did.
Did Paul Revere have any close calls or encounters with the redcoats during the ride? And was he armed to take after?
So the question for those on Zoom, did Paul Revere have any close encounters with the redcoats that night, and was he armed? He was, it's a very good question. He was not armed, and he was intentionally not armed because he felt that, as he knew, he was risking his life. But at the point that he set out, nobody had fired a shot yet. And he felt that if he had had a weapon on him, there'd be all the more cause for him to be shot. The fact that he didn't have a weapon protect him a little bit. Yes, he had a one very tight skirmish with two British soldiers on the way to Lexington, where in a pretty thrilling turn, he was able to get free, and then he was surrounded by British soldiers again on the road to Concord, and spoke very gruffly to them. They took his horse, and he continued. He was captured and held for a while, but then when he got free, he went straight back on foot into Lexington. So yeah, it was very close. And you know, I mentioned the people knew who Revere was, so everybody knew his name. Right, you knew his name in London. If you were in military activities or you cared about this stuff, you knew about it. But almost nobody knew his face. Right, because there was obviously no TV, there were no pictures in the paper, there was no, how would you know? And when they got Revere and they asked him who he was, and he said he was Revere, they're like, oh my God, it's Paul Revere, right? And so now they had something on their hands, which is like a little, like if you kidnap the wrong kid, you know, like they suddenly had this like really important person, and it kind of unnerved the British a little bit.
Yeah, you went over a little bit of how they knew that the British had a plan. It sounded like we were prepared, the Patriots were prepared. So did they know all that because it's easy to see 700 or 800 regulars being mustered for this special mission? They didn't know the specifics. Was there spying going on? You mentioned something about a British general's or officer's wife. Was that all through espionage?
So the question is sort of how did they know? Because I said, hey, they kind of knew the British were up to something. How did they know what they knew, even though they didn't know everything? And how was that? So the answer to you suggested was that espionage were there things that the British did to tip them off. The answer is yes, yes, and yes. There were a whole lot of different things that happened. But word did get around. There was a pretty large spy network on both sides. And then the British made some steps they kind of made some missteps, honestly. They tried to sort of, like, they brought in the small boats from the river because they wanted to have the river still that night and just have that boat and maybe one or two other large boats there. And that was a tip off. Like, why are they doing that? They did some other military thing. So that it was a Tuesday night when Revere rode out. But on Sunday, he made an initial ride to Lexington to kind of say, I think things are up. And it was on the way back from there that they put in the lantern system in place. So there was a lot going on, and you get it. I get into it a little bit, figuring out and making best guesses. Sometimes they guessed right, which was helpful.
I have another question from Zoom, which is, how did you go from writing about baseball to writing about Paul Revere?
Yes, thank you. The question is, how did I go from writing about baseball to writing about Paul Revere? It's a different kind of book, but in some ways it isn't. My baseball book, and I love baseball so much, but like my book 56 about Joe DiMaggio all takes place in the summer of 1941, and it's a lot about it being the time it was about DiMaggio's hitting streak, but at a time when he was an Italian-American hero that slipped far outside the bounds of the game. An Italian hero not named Capone, who people loved and followed at a time when we were about to go to war with the Italians. And it was called The Last Innocent Summer. So there's a lot of sort of social context and social history. My book on Jackie Robinson also clearly has, again, it goes outside the game, the social implications there, and even Pete Rose, which is really, the book is Pete Rose, An American Dilemma. It's a moral quandary. So for me, coming to this book, I felt completely at ease. The reporting research with a lot of overlap. Here I'm in the Massachusetts Historical Society, there I might have been in Cooperstown, but either way, I'm looking through documents and other things. So it's kind of a natural move.
How accurate is the Longfellow poem?
The question is, how accurate is the Longfellow poem? So it's, it's not 100% accurate, nor was meant to be. And he's writing a poem, and I'm grateful that he didn't fall a slave to all the individual facts, right? He told us this beautiful story that stayed with us. In essence, it's completely true. This guy got on his horse and he told people, and and so much of it is true. Longfellow doesn't mention other writers, right? He kind of wants to have a single hero as this inspiring figure. It's really just an inaccuracy of omission. And some of this sort of, for those who know the poem, it was 12 o'clock by the village clock, it was 1 o'clock by the village clock. That timing is a little bit off. He had them getting to Concord, which isn't quite right. So in spirit, it's extreme. It's very, very accurate, but it's not 100% accurate. And Longfellow, I will say, he knew that. It wasn't that he was sloppy. He lived in a house actually that George Washington had occupied during the Revolutionary War. He grew up in Portland, and he was often at the Old North Church. He had read and reread Revere's own account. So he was marshaling something the way a painter might paint a picture, or a poet might write a poem.
Do you have any final questions to close us out? If not, then I have one that actually came from a school student who was here recently, and she was asking about Sybil Luddington. Did you come across anything about Sybil Luddington?
So the question is, what about Sybil Luddington? And I will tell you, Sybil Luddington is a 16-year-old girl who rode in 1777, about 2 years after this, in Connecticut, made a ride of about 40 miles to warn people that, again, the British were advancing on Danbury, I think it was. So yes, I did come across her and followed it there's been a lot of question about whether it's actually true. There was no mention of it in her lifetime. She herself didn't even mention it when, like, later on in life, she was applying for sort of money from the war, and she didn't even mention that she'd taken this ride. So most historians think that it probably didn't happen, but it's a wonderful story. It showed up like 80 years after her death in like a family memoir, and then people got on it, and then it was a great tourism thing, and she had a stamp for her, right? Like, it's wonderful. She had a statue, like whatever people can do to make them feel good. But it doesn't seem, I do talk about her in the book a little bit.
All right, one more question.
This actually is not a question. I just want to thank you for enlightening me
I grew up in both Medford and Lexington. And so what I want to say is, tonight I learned so much, and I beg you, I really beg you to go to both the Medford and the Lexington school systems. And this fact, they're fascinating, it's entertaining, it's wonderful. And, just having walked by Buckman Tavern a million times, speaking to my mom last week, and she was crossing this, she was driving and she had to wait for 20 redcoats to cross because they were.
Oh, reenactment.
So being immersed in this, but
Yeah.
knowing so little of all this fascinating facts, literally, thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you. Great.
I'm going to just close us out with some final remarks. So thank you so much, of course, for that fantastic presentation. And thank you all for joining us tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's lecture and would like to stay up to date with all of our programs, you can join our mailing list by going to FrauncestavernMuseum.org. There you can also find our calendar of upcoming programs, including our upcoming historical cocktail class and other events. And thank you to those of you who have donated to the museum. Your generous support helps us fulfill our mission and share the history of the American Revolutionary Era with the public. We would like to give special thanks to the lead sponsors of our 250th exhibition, Path to Liberty, The Emergence of a Nation: Peter C. Hine and Anne Farley, William Hale Kirby, Mrs. Stanley DeForest Scott, and Stephen T. Whalen. If you would like to donate, you can visit our website, FrauncestavernMuseum.org. Thank you all again for joining us at this Fraunces Tavern Museum lecture, and we hope to see you all again soon. My name is Melissa. I'm the Education Public Programs Manager here. We also have books in the back. Yes, we've got a chair for you back there.
Okay, great.
Yeah.